In my third year of college, my closest friend Andrew and I decided to take a road trip. We were going to head to Virginia and visit my uncle and family, then head our way up to New York City to visit an old friend there, and then finally to get to Boston, Massachusetts to visit Andrew's sister. In each place, we'd stay 3 or 4 days and enjoy the sights and just simply being with our family and friends. We'd planned our trip for about 6 months, and when it came time, we headed off in Andrew's very old, beat-up car. We soon discovered, just a little ways down the road, that he needed new tires. Not that he had one bad tire, but that actually he needed all 4. That was delay in part of the trip number 1. Along our way, we would decide sometimes to go to different parts of wherever we were. We might take a longer road, or we might take a slightly different path than the main one. Now, this is all before GPS, so you have to remember we had paper maps, and that's just kind of how we were doing things. We'd had a pretty easy trip as we'd passed through all kinds of different middle states, and we were getting into West Virginia. And West Virginia, to Andrew and I, was a very interesting place, and we decided we wanted to see some of the back roads. So, in our moment of brilliance, and at this point we'd sort of used all the provisions that we'd brought, we took what was a lightly marked gray dashed road on our rally map. And so what that meant was that it was a road that wasn't traveled too often and was merely there. There was a little footnote that I'll tell you about in a few minutes. We headed back, and we were clearly back in sort of the backcountry of West Virginia. We saw all these old World War II row houses and people sitting on their front porches. We stopped at a really quaint little gas station and got some water and filled up the car, and we headed off into the mountains, and it was beautiful. Trees and birds and animals, and at each turn, the roads seemed to get more and more remote. And we finally got to that little gray dashed road, and we took a left, and we went up the road, and every once in a while, a truck filled with coal miners would pass us by, and they'd be covered in soot, and they were clearly finishing, this was probably late in the afternoon, they were clearly finishing their day's work. After about the third one of them, they waved us down, they said, "What are you boys doing?" So we're going on a trip, and we're just taking this back road, and they said, you best turn around and follow us out here, because we're going to lock that gate, and you wouldn't be able to get out of this back part of the country for another 3 or 4 days. Somehow we managed to get ourselves on a mining road, not a public road, and we managed to get ourselves so far back in the mountains that we were about to have quite a journey. The interesting little footnote was, do not use the roads unless you have local knowledge. It was a great trip, and we had such a great time. There were so many different things that we learned and different things that happened. We got lost in New York City. We had trouble in Washington, D.C. We had to have more car work done when we got to Boston. But I'll never forget that day on that road in West Virginia. Kind of lost, kind of in awe of creation, and kind of not necessarily on the right track. I thought about this when I read this gospel and Jesus sending his apostles and disciples out 2 by 2. Now, Andrew and I had nothing near the mission that the apostles had. We were just out for fun. But I was thinking about the adventures that they would have gone on. Jesus gives them not a whole lot of instruction other than just to go out into the community and share the gospel with people. He tells them to take minimal provisions. Go with someone else. Take nothing for your journey except for a staff, no bread, no bag, no money, or anything else. Wear sandals. Only take one tunic. What kind of adventure would that be? I think this is a great ministry message for all of us to hold right before us, especially in leadership in the church. To remind ourselves that when those who were first sent to do ministry were told simply to get to the essence of what they were doing. Think about that just for a minute in your own life. How complicated it is to travel. How complicated it is just to set out for a day's work. How complicated it is to do anything if we really start to think about it. How much we feel we need just to get life done. I think if we really take an honest listen to this gospel, we might be called back to something more pure. I've noticed in the last few weeks at a number of events and other things I've been at, things are beginning to happen and we're doing things again now that the pandemic is sort of over. We're not quite there, but it's getting there. But in some ways, things have been simpler. Some of the extra stuff that used to happen, maybe not so much. It's more down to pure events or pure things. I think there's a call to all of us as we're walking through this world to get back to some of our more simplistic ways of relating with each other. You see, the beauty in the gospel is not just that Jesus was sending them out 2 by 2, but he was sending them out to rely on each other, but also to rely on the community around them. Jesus knew that as people embraced them, their needs would be cared for. Jesus knew that the message that they were offering was so critical and needed that people would open their hearts. And Jesus continues in the gospel and is clear. If you go somewhere and the people hear you, stay and teach. If they don't hear you, brush it off and move on to someone else that will hear. What if in our own life we look to more of a simple task such as this? Maybe our life is too cluttered, and maybe the pauses that the pandemic gave us might have made that more clear. Maybe our life is too busy or unfocused, or maybe like Andrew and I, you're lost, and you can hardly hear the warning signs around you pleading out to turn around and go a different direction. What is it that you're called to do as a ministry? What is it that God stirs in your heart? On this weekend, we gather in celebration of our nation's birth. And our nation has been on many different roads and many different adventures. There's so much to look back and to reflect on, so many things to be grateful for, and so much work left to be done. As we gather with our family and friends, as we gather around the table, as we celebrate and focus, where is your map? Where are you going? Where is God calling you to be? And what is your ministry? There is an adventure ahead for you in God's kingdom. And I think when we listen to these calls of these words that we hear as Jesus calls his disciples, and when we reflect and hear our own call to be Jesus' disciples, that path that's ahead for us is very much filled with adventure and joy. Where are you called to serve? Who are you called to serve? Where is God leading you? Amen.